I'm Wenna Fullerton. I am a neurodivergent consultant and HR professional, and I run the Neurodivergent Collective, and I support neurodivergent people in all walks of life. So, in the workplace, in education, and also throughout the assessment process, both pre and post assessment.
And hello, everyone. My name is Roy Magara. I'm an employment law solicitor at my own employment law firm, Magara Law. We help employers and employees across the UK, but mainly England and Wales, in all sorts, as I say, of employment law matters. And today, in this video, we're going to be talking about ADHD, and more so from an employment law context, when it is an expert in her field in terms of helping people with ADHD and particularly in the workplace too. And we often get lots of clients in this sphere too. So, Wenna, first question, what is ADHD?
So there's probably a few answers I can give to this. And I think from a very clinical perspective, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. Now, as someone who has lived experience with ADHD, I see it more as part of me and not in a kind of clinical sense. And I know when I support people, especially, again, whether that's in the workplace, wherever that may be, it's much more that kind of holistic approach. ADHD itself can be there's lots and lots of strengths to ADHD, but there's lots of challenges as well. So things like our executive functioning skills, which are essentially our life skills that we build up from birth up to, wherever we are in life, whether that's adulthood, teenagehood, and that can affect things like communication, task initiation, planning, kind of self-control as well. There's also kind of sensory elements as well. So a lot of people with ADHD can find that they have sensory sensitivities, or they like kind of sensory seeking as well. And I know that kind of any sensory kind of triggers or avoidance is often kind of seen more. I think people associate it more with autism, but it's just as kind of prominent with ADHD as well. There's also things like how we process information that can look very differently, how we communicate, and just overall how we see the world. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many strengths that do come along with that. So in terms of kind of in employees with ADHD, it's a really, really, really great kind of talent pool that I think that is not utilized enough. And there are many, many successful ADHD people in the world. And it's really about, when we're thinking about kind of reasonable adjustments and things like that, it's looking at getting the right specific support for people so they can thrive in the workplace.
Thanks for that. And next question we're going to look at is, can I be fired for having ADHD at work? And I'll kick this one off. So the short answer is no. You cannot, or you ought not to be, rather, solely fired for having ADHD in the workplace. And as you've touched on, when ADHD is considered a disability under the Equality Act 2010, and in brief terms, what this means is that employers have a legal duty to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate employees with disabilities in the workplace. And we'll touch on what reasonable adjustments are in a short while. However, to begin with, I think it's important to note, first of all, if someone's ADHD may have an impact on their performance and the employer hasn't made the necessary adjustments, then often what employers do is just enforce disciplinary action instead of having a conversation as to how they're supposed to help, how they're supposed to help the employee. And secondly, in the scope of discrimination, if an employee does feel that they're being discriminated against or treated unfairly or less favorably because of their ADHD, they may well have grounds for discrimination. So one practical step, and we'll talk about this in due course, if someone is facing challenges at work, due to their ADHD, one of the things that they may want to consider is disclosing that condition. And that can be an open dialogue with your line manager, your employer, about potential reasonable adjustments or accommodations that can be made. But also, uh, seeking support is a really good thing to do. And when you being at the Neurodivergent Collective, you are one of those organizations that can support people, that can support groups of people, that can provide advice and guidance in this sphere.
It can be quite an overwhelming conversation to start with an employer. I think there are, I think sometimes there is a view that people need to disclose straight away, which is not always the case, and things change because sometimes people are diagnosed whilst they've been in employment for some time, or it may be that they're moving to a new role, so they may have been promoted, and or there's kind of a change in their team, so they feel that they need to disclose, or they feel that they've tried to do their role for some time, but feel that the challenges that they face in work with the ADHD is is getting too much, and they need that extra support. And sometimes it's because people don't understand, and that's employees and employers, kind of what support is out there. And there's certainly there's lots of kind of options and things to look at in terms of kind of reasonable adjustments, and even some really kind of small, very cost effective changes that again, I kind of play that down and say that they're very small, but they can have such a huge positive impact on people.
Let's start with what are reasonable adjustments to begin with, and then more specifically, reasonable adjustments for those in ADHD who are banding around that term. And from my perspective, a reasonable adjustment is some kind of accommodation that an employer can make in order to ensure that someone with a particular disability or condition, for example, in this case, we're talking about ADHD, is essentially on the same or at least as close to the best level playing field as everyone else, so they don't feel or they are not, in reality, being treated less favorably, whether knowingly or unknowingly to the employer. Would you agree with that definition, or would you maybe scope out on that?
Yes, I agree with that definition. I think I think it's, I suppose in terms of kind of there's the legal aspect to reasonable adjustments, but also I think as as an employer, you should want to get the best. You should, out of your employees, but you should, I think that probably leads into kind of that duty of care to some extent, but I think you should want to help your people feel supported, to be happy, feel safe, both kind of physically and psychologically at work as well. And I think sometimes that can fall down quite early on in terms of that kind of working relationship. So I think that definition is, perfectly describes it, but I think there's probably some other layers to that as well.
Quite right. And let's look at some of those practical layers, then I dare say, in regard to ADHD. So often, certainly with the clients that I have and a number of the issues that they face in this particular space, um, ADHD is indeed a spectrum. It's unique to each and every single individual. And I find that some of the um, general challenges, as it were, or conditions and environments that those with ADHD find challenging, one of them is noise and sensitivity to that. So not just random bits of technology around them, but that also includes colleagues as well. And I find that sometimes those with ADHD um, can find noise distracting, and in some cases make it quite impossible to focus. So if that's a problem, what are some probable solutions? With that particular one in mind, I find that advising an employer or an employee in the space of relocating somewhere quieter, for example, noise cancellation headphones, are two kind of immediate things that I can think about that often help those with ADHD focus if they've got to be in the workplace. And I'll pass on to you, Ed, in terms of other examples that you might have of reasonable adjustments that employers can make that you often find quite effective and powerful.
So I think there's in terms of the kind of the noise, so that leads into that kind of that sensory kind of avoidance, because I think there's often a big challenge with filtering noise. So it may be loud noises are fine, or one person talking in an office environment is fine, but when that's several people, that can all sound kind of at the same level. So it could be really, really difficult for someone to concentrate. So one of the options I would always suggest, and again, it really depends on the role, and the ability for someone to do that is to look at remote working, or at least I think for ADHD, what works quite well for a lot of people, not everyone, is hybrid working. So having the option to, I don't know, for instance, say they've got a project due that they really need to focus on and do need that kind of quiet space, having the ability to work from home, or even in the office, having the ability to have kind of to go into a smaller kind of office where it is quieter, to kind of have that chance to be able to focus, and that will support with that kind of task initiation as well, and overall productivity, um, while keeping someone feeling quite calm because their sensory needs are being met. But in terms of kind of that, looking at that kind of working location and the ability to work remotely, I think it's good to give people a choice, because what we often see with ADHD, and I know it's certainly something I experience as well, is um, it's great to have that quiet time, but sometimes there's also that need to kind of feel motivated and need to be around, our peers at work as well. And I think it's, so kind of to be creative with ideas, to, have that social interaction. That's also something that we can often seek. And that can help with kind of our dopamine seeking as well. So having the ability to do both is a really a great option to provide people with, and also being flexible with that, because there may be times where I think a lot of kind of working models, especially these days after the pandemic, is kind of hybrid, and you need to be in for 3 days a week, and it needs to be on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, for instance. But that can still be quite restrictive, because I think what we can often see is employees with ADHD, they can't choose when they're going to be feeling more sociable, and if they are feeling anxious at all, which anxiety, high levels of anxiety is very, very common for people with ADHD. It can really kind of shift and change quite quickly. So if we're looking at a working model being quite restrictive, that again can sometimes not be as supportive as it often looks on paper. So thinking about, for instance, if someone is, contracted to work Monday to Friday, do they have the option and the flexibility to come in for once a week, or some weeks they can come in for 4 days a week, depending on the kind of the needs and the support that they need that week. What are they working on, and allowing that flexibility, and the choice of both worlds can often be um, a very good kind of support method.
Thank you very much for that. One other thing that I often find quite helpful is in the space of project deadlines and timeliness rather. So looking at dedicated reminder systems, or what timelines are indeed essential for that individual with ADHD, and having a conversation around that, and I think often having clarity on what the requirements are and when they need to be met, and the efficiency for which that a product needs, are some things that often people with ADHD will find quite useful in that workspace here. Great, thank you. So last question, what could the conversation look like between an employee and a line manager? How do you often advise people in this space?
So I think it's fine to have an informal conversation about it, but in terms of actually requesting it, I think it's always advisable to make that more formal and to put that in writing. Now, that doesn't need to be, a very long letter, and obviously that is an option for people to do, but it can be an email so that there is, I suppose, a paper trail, and that, that evidence that you have put that in writing is also useful as well, because it's that kind of, I think, that confirmation of, the time that you've sent it, how long you've had to wait for anything to be implemented, or, a response, either way. So I would always advise, whether you feel comfortable enough to have that informal conversation, that you still follow that up and request any reasonable adjustments you require in writing. One of the biggest challenges that I see um, employees face is, I think, and again, one of, is a lot of the time people don't know what reasonable adjustments they need. So they will often, I will speak to them and they will say, I know I need support. I really am struggling at the moment, but I don't know what I need. Um, and you see that a lot where people are starting with a new employer, so they've started a new role, or people that are newly diagnosed. So they are fully aware that they need the support, but upon having that conversation and approaching their employer, often they are met with, yes, we are happy to support you. What would you like, or what do you need? And that's where the conversation really kind of draws to a full halt, because it's almost, a kind of situation of someone needs to know what support needs to go in place, and often it's kind of lost there, and it really kind of, it falls down at that first hurdle, and that can be really, really difficult, and it can create a kind of lack of trust. But I think we have to remember that it's a very big question for employers who are often not kind of trained kind of workplace assessors, or even if an employee has gone through occupational health, they are often not kind of professionally trained to know very much about ADHD. They may just know kind of very surface level. They may not be kind of, have that specialist knowledge there. And then we also have to think the kind of the onus on the employee is huge. That's very, very overwhelming for someone just to know kind of off the cuff exactly what they need. That is very, very rare. And I think that lack of trust can be born from that point, where an employer, I think, sees that an employee should know, and the employee thinks that the employer should know. But that's often not the case.
Quite right. There has to be both a balance there. The employee needs to be able to communicate in some way, shape, or form what those adjustments that they or accommodations they need are, and the employer should not equally just solely rely on the employee to provide them with that knowledge. But it's really important for both parties to be equipped. And so, last question: if anyone needs you, whether an employer or an employee in that case, uh, how do they contact you?
They can contact us through our website. We have a hopefully very easy contact form, and our website is www.theneurodivergentcollective.co.uk, and we'd be happy to help anyone, whether it's helping with the kind of reasonable adjustments, or how to approach that conversation at any stage of their employment journey.
Indeed. And should things need to get legal, then you can indeed contact me. My firm's website is www.magaralaw.co.uk. Both of our details are in the comments and the description below, and you're welcome to get in touch.